Hello. We're here now to consider the question, what is energy? Energy is a puzzling concept, and for most of our history, humanity has struggled to really define energy. I don't think it's one of those concepts that is easily defined. I don't think it's one of those things where you can write one single line to describe it and everything is clear. It is, I think, one of those concepts that needs some description, it needs some consideration, it needs some head scratching, it needs some careful thought. And then you start understanding energy and its nature, and you start moving closer to at least an understanding, if not a precise definition. But to get started, I think we can sort of say, well, energy is about the ability to make change. Now, that is a pretty hand waving definition, but I'll use it as the starting point because you could say, well, politicians can make changes. Um, Social people in social media can cause change. So, yeah, all right. So, there's some sort of energy involved, but not the kind of energy that we're describing, I suppose. But I think it's a starting point. And just to explain a little bit about how we developed our understanding of energy, for literally, I think, thousands of years, we had no real good definition of energy. Even great thinkers from the Greeks and subsequent to the Greek philosophers, they really struggled with what is the nature of energy. They were aware of it, but really couldn't come to grips with it. And it's only in the 19th century that we started to get some very good understandings about energy. And this is born in a field which we call classical thermodynamics. And classical thermodynamics is a field where, starting off some quite simple concepts, you build up a quite thorough picture of the general nature of energy. And this was a great triumph of the 19th century, and very useful. It actually had great connections with the development of industry, in particular, like, for example, engines and refrigeration cycles and such things. So so it was a great triumph of the 19th century. Towards the 19th century, there's also another form of thermodynamics called statistical thermodynamics, and that was particularly associated with Gibbs, one of the great geniuses of thermodynamics. And what people try to do with statistical thermodynamics is build up the principles from classical thermodynamics, looking at the molecular level. So trying to look at how literally thousands and thousands of molecules or millions of molecules would behave under different conditions, and see whether you could deduce basic principles. What was a great triumph is that they showed that the principles of statistical thermodynamics, the principles that emerged from statistical thermodynamics, were completely consistent with what had been derived from classical thermodynamics. So it's one of the absolute triumphs of science, one of the most celebrated achievements of modern science. And that then led into a great improved understanding and appreciation of all matters to do with energy. The 20th century saw even some more profound breakthroughs. In particular, we started to understand the nature of chemical bonding, the structure of the atom, the behavior of subatomic particles, and this gave us an even more profound insight into the nature of energy. And we started to see how energy occurred at literally the atomic level. And then, of course, this led to an extraordinary insight by Einstein, who identified that mass and energy had some interchangeability, and that this was needed to be understood if you want to understand the nature of the universe. So we're not talking about trivial topics here. We're talking about topics that have occupied some of the most brilliant minds of the last 100 to 200 years, trying to come to grips with energy. Um, I gather it's self-evident to everybody watching this that energy is of completely profound importance to humanity. Energy is the essence of life. We are consuming energy and generating energy. We couldn't exist without energy, and it also influences almost every aspect. The machines around us, the systems for cooling and heating us, and transporting, everything around us is so influenced by energy. So, energy is literally everywhere, and we're thinking and influenced by energy all the time. So, it's both a subject that has advanced a lot in the last couple of hundred years, but also its importance to humanity is obviously incredibly clear. I think one thing that is very important when we're discussing energy to realize is that you see a lot of people discussing energy, particularly in political debates or in social media, for example, and they are discussing energy sometimes in a very hand waving manner, a bit imprecise. It's not really clear exactly what they're talking about. Actually, this kind of issues is what actually generated this initial interest in developing the science of energy. Uh, One of the great founders of thermodynamics is a gentleman called Carnot, who was a French military officer in the 19th century, and he had a profound insight into the nature of steam engines, which in turn is a profound insight into the nature of energy in general. And he was motivated by a desire to understand how to make engines more efficient. That was his driving motivation. So, this sort of connection between the practical and the profound is something that is really interesting in the science of energy. The fact that thermodynamics is both an incredibly theoretical and intellectually challenging topic, but at the same time has immensely practical outcomes, is one of the most fascinating aspects of this topic. It's one of the reasons that I'm attracted to it. So I promised to give you some sort of greater sense of what energy is by describing energy. So let's just go through a quick sort of look at the major forms of energy. I think the most obvious forms of energy that we can make sense of, the ones that are the obvious, the most simplest one to make sense of, is thermal energy. Basically, if you've ever held a cup of coffee in your hand and felt the heat flow into your hand, or stood near a fire, or experienced standing next to a radiator, we all understand thermal energy. So it's something that's making us warm. It's interesting when I use the cup of coffee example. In a cup of coffee, um, there is heat being given, and the heat there's the amount of heat associated with the warm cup of coffee. But there's also these mechanisms by which heat is transferring to us, like, for example, conduction. That's transferring from the cup, right, through the cup and conducting through the walls of the cup onto our hands. That's the process of conduction. Then we also have the heat coming off the top of the cup. You feel a bit of see some of the, maybe the movement of air bring some of the heat. That's what's called convection. It's another famous form of heat transfer is the technical term. And then the third term, which isn't so noticeable with a cup of coffee, but very, very noticeable with a fire, is radiant heat. So this is actually heat radiating from the hot source. And these are the three famous forms of heat transfer. Now, interestingly, that topic of how heat transfers is itself a separate science, right? So we're going to sort of be concentrating on the thermodynamics and talking a little bit about the heat transfer. But just to appreciate, of course, these two things are interconnected and very important. But in thermodynamics, we're really talking about the amount of energy or the amount of work, or trying to quantify the overall effect, where heat transfer is something where we're trying to understand how fast, we're trying to understand the rate. And so these two topics are split, maybe artificially, you could argue, and we sort of study them separately. So in these series of lectures, I'm going to be talking about thermodynamics principally as the science of energy. And you may be asking at this stage, why isn't this called thermodynamics and not the science of energy? Well, in my experience, if you say the word thermodynamics, it tends to cause people to leave the room. How would I know this? Because I've been teaching thermodynamics for many, many years. So I thought the science of energy sounded a bit friendlier. I don't know. Do you agree? I hope you don't feel I'm been drawing you with false advertising at this point. But we're going to be discussing really these limits. All right. Now we've identified thermal. That's one of the easiest forms of energy to understand. Then there's mechanical, and that's also pretty easy to understand. If you're standing in front of me and I run with you at some velocity and I hit you, this is clearly mechanical energy, and a form of mechanical energy called kinetic energy that you're experiencing as I arrive. There are other forms of mechanical energy, and we're going to discuss that. But mechanical energy is a relatively simple concept to explain and to understand. Um, Another form of energy is electrical energy, and anybody who's ever looked at an electric radiator or seen an electric motor work or has an electric car, for example. So this is another obvious form of energy, and we use electrical energy all the time to transform, change things. Remember, we're going back to that idea. For starting definition, energy is this thing that has the ability to change. So electrical energy is pretty self-evident in terms of our experience. The next one is chemical energy. And we've already talked about chemical energy a little bit because, for example, in some of these things I've already spoken about, you need combustion, right, to get the energy. So this is really about the rearrangement of molecules. So a process like combustion is really rearranging molecules, and there's an energy change associated with that. Combustion being a really famous example, but there are many, many chemical types of changes. I should also reveal at this stage that underneath the heading of thermodynamics, there are different types of thermodynamicists, and I'm definitely a chemical thermodynamicist. All right, that doesn't mean I don't love mechanical thermodynamics. I do quite a bit, but chemical thermodynamics is my first passion and something that I've spent a good deal of my career understanding and researching. So I'll probably give lots of examples of chemical thermodynamics because it's something that's dear to my heart. The other type of energy that we need to talk about is nuclear energy. So nuclear energy is a more recent type of energy that we've been able to harness. We've, of course, been living off nuclear energy for a long time because the sun is a giant nuclear reactor, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So the whole essence of life is coming from a nuclear reaction, many kilometers and miles away from us. And that nuclear energy is something that we've learned to harness in the last 100 years or a bit less than 100 years. So it's obviously an incredibly important form of energy. And once again, you start thinking, well, nuclear energy, mechanical energy, chemical energy, are these all the same things? Well, that's one of the triumphs of the science of energy, is that there are good common underlying principles beneath all these different forms of energy that are the same. You can use the same principles, the same ideas to analyze the energy from all these different sources. So that's one of the great triumphs about the science of energy, is that we can use a common set of principles to make sense of these apparently quite different phenomena. So what we've got here now, a moment, we've come away with a vague definition to start with, that energy is something that causes change, right? And then we've started to describe these different types of energy, and I've gone through thermal, mechanical, electrical, chemical, and nuclear. So it's not a very big list, but it's a list worth remembering. I've made the distinction between studying the amounts of energy, which is thermodynamics, with the rate of change, which is heat transfer. So we're going to talk a bit more about thermodynamics and the heat transfer in the next series of lectures. And we've also brought out that, there is a common set of principles that can be used to describe these apparently different phenomena. I was going to finish by making this observation. What I absolutely love about this topic is that thermodynamics is both intellectually incredibly important and challenging series of ideas, but it's also profoundly practical. And I think Carnot is the great example. I mean, Carnot's sometimes called the father of thermodynamics. I could argue whether he is or not, but certainly a very major figure. And His profound intellectual insights came from a practical problem of why is one steam engine more efficient than another? And from that, he developed this extremely profound view of how energy works that affects the entire universe. I've always found that absolutely inspiring and amazing. I hope you do as well, and I look forward to talking to you further about energy.